All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Nathan Silvera. I am the Family Services and Sales Manager with Dignity Memorial and in Brant County out of Thorpe's Brothers Funeral Home. With me today, I have Michelle, who has many multiple last names, so we'll just leave it as Michelle for the time being. And Michelle is our location manager and one of the funeral directors at Thorpe Brothers Funeral Home as well. So our plan today is to talk about your life and your legacy, how to go about making arrangements and planning to make it right. But more importantly, sharing some education and a topic that at times can be cumbersome or difficult to have. Yet we're going to try and make it as simple as possible so that everybody's got an understanding of, what the steps are, how it works, and why it's a benefit to have this conversation and to look at planning in advance to make it easier for your families, for your loved ones, and even for yourself. Thorpe's has been serving the community of Brantford since 1860, so we have been around for quite some time. And this is something that we love to do is getting together with a group of people and sharing kind of some of the information that may at times be difficult to find. The world of Google is fantastic. However, in our industry is still very hidden, and also on how to make things a little bit easier. So with that being said, we're going to get started. And the way we get started is we actually put out a survey back in 2015 to figure out what life's most stressful events were. And the reason we did that, and the reason this study was put together was to have an understanding on just the general population's effects of stress and what events in their lives are most stressful and how they can cope with them or deal with them. So as you can see on the screen, there are 6 things that were put there. And in your head, kind of rank them from 1 to 6. So based on, what would be most stressful in your life, or what out of those items has been more stressful for you. And then we'll see how you match up compared to the results we got from the survey in just a second. But one of the things that we realized is out of the 6 most stressful events in a life, 2 of them come from the loss of a loved one or a spouse or a partner. And that's a big chunk of what we deal with when it comes to stress in our lifetimes. And unfortunately, we all need to get there at some point or another, whether we've lost a spouse or a loved one, we'll all be there. But what I'll do now is I'll show you actually what the results were and how it ranked from most stressful to least stressful. And none of these events are not stressful. So we all have an understanding of what that looks like. So when the survey came back, this is how it came to us. So the death of a spouse or a partner ranked first. Divorce ranked second. The death of a loved one ranked third. Personal injury or illness was fourth. Marriage was fifth. And sixth was loss of a job. Now, at any point in time in our lives, regardless of our age, regardless of our economical background, and even our cultural differences, we all have to, as I mentioned earlier, go through the death of a loved one at a minimum. Not everybody is married, so not everybody can be divorced. Not everybody gets injured or loses a job, but unfortunately, we all have to go through life at some point, losing a loved one. And one of the most stressful things that can happen in that moment is not having an understanding as to what can we do or how can we be prepared for this event before it becomes a reality. So typically what happens when we're dealing with stressful events is we get to the scenario of what now. So to paint an easier picture as we go along this journey together is put yourself in a place where maybe you've had a loved one who passed away. Maybe you've had to make arrangements for someone in the past. And typically the first question we think about is what now? What's the first step? What's the first thing we need to do to make sure we're prepared and that we're doing the things properly? Now, in this scenario of the what now, most times something hasn't been arranged in advance, which then adds more stress and grief to the family. And it allows a clouded decision to come over all of our heads. So when we look at what now and what's important, the first thing is, do we know who to call? So once a death has occurred, who is the first person we should call? Now, in any scenario, it could be a variance of people. But one of the things is having that information in advance and being able to understand, what is the right scenario? If we were to pass away at home unexpectedly, the first call should probably go out to a 911 call. The funeral home will accept your phone call. We have no problem with that, but we can't come until things have been taken care of in advance. So having an understanding of who to call, first is always extremely beneficial. And again, in every scenario, that person may be someone a little bit different. Then the next question we have once we've lost a loved one is, do we know how they would have wanted to be remembered? So again, if we go back to this place of we've arranged for a loved one in the past, we've lost a loved one in the past, did we know what we chose for them at that time? Do we know why we picked it? Do we even know if that's what they wanted or how they would have wanted to be remembered? And then more importantly, when we're on this call, we're all here and we're all able to have this conversation together. But then the question comes down to, does our family know how we want to be remembered? Do they know what our wishes are? But even at a higher level, do we know what we want for ourselves? And do we know how we want to be remembered? Then the next part after that, once we've thought about how we want to be remembered and what are the things that are needed to make sure that you are prepared and that your family prepared, is where do you start? Now, I always like to reference funerals or planning for a funeral to that of planning for a wedding. And the reason I say that is you got to start somewhere. So there's no harm, there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer, but hopefully today, as we continue to talk, we'll shed some light on the steps on how it goes and where you can start. But one of the most important pieces to starting is knowing if you'd like to be cremated or traditionally buried. And that's a decision that's up to each individual person and will allow you to kind of have that conversation and to start the process of what it looks like. So from there, we go about talking about protecting our families and doing things in advance because they make sense. So again, planning a funeral is very similar to planning a wedding, but most times in life, we plan for all of major life events. We plan for weddings, we plan for college education for our children and our grandchildren. We plan for our retirements. We plan for little things like vacations and gatherings. And we do all these things because they matter and they're important. They're things that we know we're going to go through in life, and they're things that we want to make sure we're prepared for. The second part to that is we walk through life and we make sure we put protection in place for the things that may or may never happen. If I asked for a show of hands, and I'm not going to, but if we were all together in a room, I would say, how many people have homeowners insurance or contents insurance? How many people have, vehicle insurance and life insurance and all of these other insurances that we put in our life? Some because we have to, like a vehicle insurance, but others because we worry about the what if something happens. So when we have this conversation of planning, and then we have the conversation of looking at how do we protect our family, we then come to the point of looking at, if there's one thing that unfortunately is inevitable, does it not make sense to plan for it in advance? And as much as it can be a daunting conversation, it's something that is much easier done sitting with someone like myself than it is with Michelle at the time of need when our loved ones are no longer there. And sitting with Michelle is still very nice and it is very easy, but it's a much more difficult conversation to be had. So from then we look at why it's smart and what are the ideas behind putting a plan together. Well, one is it shows our family that we care about them. It shows them that we love them. David had a great brain teaser this morning before we got started here and spoke about love. But the reality is when we put things in place for our families and we plan and prepare ourselves for some of the things that we may deal with in life, we're doing it because we're worried about others. We're worried about ourselves and what would happen to us if we weren't here. But we're more so concerned about everybody else we're going to leave behind. So by planning in advance, we take away all of the hard decisions that need to be made. When you sit with a funeral director at the time of need, when the loved one has passed away, and there's no plans in place, there's about 120 questions that are asked in a 2.5 to 3 hour period. It's a lot of questions. We can take away all the guessing work in advance by having a conversation of understanding what are the steps needed and what are the things that we would like. Then we take away the second guessing. Did I do the right thing? Did I do what they wanted? I always use myself as a great reference. I have 4 children. My eldest is 7. My 2 youngest are 2.5. They're twins. And God forbid something happened to me yesterday and I had passed away. If my arrangements weren't put in place, my wife would be stuck with answering the questions to my children 10, 15, 20 years from now. Hey, Mom, why did you pick that for Dad? Why did Dad get buried or cremated? Why did we do something or didn't do anything? And those are some of the questions that we could get faced with down the road when things aren't put in place ahead of time. But more importantly, to my wife, in my scenario, she no longer has to guess as to what I would like. And she doesn't have to guess about what the options are on what it looks like. And then lastly, my favorite part of putting things in place in advance and why it's so beneficial to have this conversation is funerals, like everything else in the world, have inflation. And there's a great theory out there that the cost of funerals is extremely expensive, but it's still less than a lot of the other major life purchases we have. We've done a study from 2021 back to 1980. So over 31 years, 41 years, on what the cost of inflation has been in comparison to a funeral, to the purchase of a new home, a college education, the cost of gas, even the price of college tuition. And funerals have gone up 186% in that time frame. The average cost of a funeral in 1980 was $2,837. The average cost in 2021 worked out just shy of $8,000. So the cost of funerals has substantially gone up over time. But when we look at putting a plan in place and we look at the decisions that we can take away from our family by doing it on our own, we actually stopped the cost of funeral arrangements from rising by guaranteeing the cost at today's value. This can be done at any local funeral home. And when you put your funeral plans in place and you secure them with a financial backing, what ends up happening is that cost, your funeral today, will never be cheaper than it will be for the rest of your life. So doing that in advance not only puts the peace of mind on the financial component, but it also has taken away all the difficult decisions and any second guessing that could happen. So how do you go about planning your funeral? How do you go about having this conversation in an easy light? And how do you go about doing it in a situation where I'm coming at you today virtually, and having a dialogue with your loved ones, with professionals in the industry, with your financial advisors and lawyers? Because a great estate component is a three-pronged approach of your financial advisor, your lawyer, and the funeral home that's going to be taking care of your wishes at the time. And that can sound daunting. Nicely, we've broken it down into 4 very simple steps for everybody, and we're going to go through them individually in just a moment. So first, we reflect. When we're looking at putting our plans in place, we need to understand, how do we want to be remembered? What is that service or celebration of life or gathering or traditional funeral moment going to say about your life, your wishes, and the things that you want to be remembered as? This is extremely important. A funeral today does not look the same as it did 15 to 20 years ago. I was brought up in a very traditional Catholic Portuguese family where if we went to the funeral home and you spoke, you get a little tap in the back of the head, politely. Now we go to a funeral and there's laughter and celebration and stories and memories to be shared. But having an understanding of what's important to you is what really reflects back to your family. And I know I've used the word funeral quite a bit. And the reason we do that is, for us in the industry, there are many terms that we can have when it comes to your end of life celebration, your gathering, your funeral service, however you want to word it. But to us, the word funeral will always hold near and dear to our heart, because regardless of the term we've given it moving forward, it's still a remembrance of the person who lived in the life that was lived. Then, as I had mentioned earlier, on where do you start? Do you wish to be buried or cremated? Now, you can be cremated and still buried. There are still options for that. But having an understanding as to what's important to you and what's beneficial is the most important. The other thing that comes with that, and a lot of people probably have this as a question on their own, is cremation less expensive than burial? Or is it cheaper to be cremated than it is to be buried? However we want to word that. And the reality is this: when we look at funeral costs and the costs of a funeral, cremation or burial can be almost the exact same price. The determining factor on the cost of your funeral, regardless of the funeral home you choose, will be the services in which you choose. So if you were to choose, and this is a great representation of a great scenario I've dealt with recently, I would like to have a visitation with my body present. I would like a service at a church, and then I'd like to be cremated later. That cost is roughly in and around between $500 and $2,000 less than if you did the exact same thing and were buried in a casket. So it always comes down to personal preference at times when we're looking at the type of service, not necessarily the idea that cremation will be cheaper. Yes, it can be, and there are options for that, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that in your scenario and in your plan or your wish, will that be a factor. So once we've taken the time to reflect, we then look at how do we record our wishes? How do we share our wishes? There are many tools out there that can be used for yourself, for your family. Some people are really good and they have really good end of life folders at home, whether electronic or in a filing cabinet. Some people are not the greatest at recording things down and not knowing what to do. And, if you speak to your local funeral home, just like us, most of us have a book or a planner of sorts that you could record your wishes, and it paints a picture as to what your estate should look like. But more importantly, it's where you get to write down all of the questions that have answers. Things like, what's your mother's maiden name? Because that's needed to register a death. Where was your father born? What's your social insurance number? All of these things are pieces of information that will be needed at the time of your passing, but more importantly, if they're not written down, can become extremely complicated for our families to answer at the time of need. So once we've taken the time to look at what our wishes are and record everything down, then we look at securing our arrangements. This is the third step in the 4-step process. With securing our arrangements, as I mentioned earlier, the cost of funerals continue to rise, so we get to lock in the price. We guarantee the cost of the funeral the day you purchase it at any funeral home, compared to the time of having to pay for that cost when you pass away. Also, with buying funerals and having a funeral arrangement, at your local funeral home, when you show up and someone has passed away, they will be asking you, and how would you like to pay for this? Gone are the days of waiting for life insurance options in many scenarios and having a timeline of sorts as to how long we can take to make arrangements and pay for those arrangements. However, when we do our arrangements in advance, we don't have to pay for them in full. There are convenient payment options at all local funeral homes that will be able to support you and your budget and your finances to ensure that your wishes are met. But one of the most important pieces of securing the arrangements as well is to ease the financial burden from the loved ones that you're leaving behind. In a lot of scenarios, and I use mine specifically, if I had passed away yesterday with 4 children at home, a mortgage, and a whole bunch of other payments that we have to deal with, my wife would probably struggle to pay for our funeral without worrying about, where's the money going to come from? She's a stay-at-home mother. I'm the one who goes to work so she can take care of the kids. But even in a scenario where if I was older, that financial burden of me passing away and not having arrangements in place would then be left to my children. And regardless of what their financial situation may be at that time, it could be a burden for them to have to come up with the funds to cover the costs of funeral arrangements, especially when inflation becomes a factor at that point. So by securing your arrangements, you find a great funding option. You find a great way to pay a much more affordable price than the day you pass away. And you take away any of the financial burden that would be stuck with your family at that time, regardless of the scenario. Then finally, the 4th step, and my favorite step in all of funeral planning, is to share. So like yourselves who have joined today, to get information, to have a conversation, and to have an understanding as to what does it take and what are the things that are there and available for you, you get to share that information with the ones you love. I always talk about, every person I meet, and I don't just say this because I do it for a living, I say it because I mean it. You have the opportunity to tell someone, hey, you know what? I've gone ahead and I've planned my arrangements. I've taken away that burden. I've taken away that guesswork. I've taken away the grief that comes with sitting in an appointment and emotionally overspending at the time of a passing with every single person you care about. That could be your neighbor. That could be your children. It could be your lawyer, a minister, a pastor, someone who you're connected to. But you get to share the information of such an important step that we need to take in life. Because what we do in life, and we all do this, is we share all of the major victories we have. We share when our children are born. We share when our grandchildren are born. We celebrate things like birthdays and anniversaries and retirements, and we share that with the people we care the most about. So planning a funeral in advance does the exact same thing, and having that ability to say, Johnny, I put my arrangement in place. You never have to worry about it. When that time comes, you call the funeral home, they'll take care of the rest. Is just something that is so relieving. And once it's been taken care of, that burden comes off of your shoulders as well as to what could happen. So the sharing piece is extremely important in the 4-step process to ensure that everybody around you knows the steps you've taken, the things you've done to help prepare them, but more importantly, the things that will help guide you. Now, how do you pick a funeral home? This is a great question and something we get asked on a regular basis. There are many different options when we have conversations as to what's important. But one of the most beneficial things is picking someone you trust. And the reason we do that is when you pick a provider that you trust, it then extends that information to your family. It has that dialogue with them that you've taken care of everything. You've chosen a provider. You've done everything necessary in the building or in the service that you would like. Because at the end of the day, it just shows that you care about them. It shows that you're trying to give them the peace of mind they deserve, that you're protecting them from any financial burden. But most importantly, you're making sure that your wishes and the way you have gone about coming up with your decision and how you would want to be remembered is the path or the walkway that they will have to follow at the time of your passing. So when we do that, we have great dialogue, we have great stories, and some of the things we love to share. And one of the things I always speak about as well is I sat down with my parents a couple of years ago to do this exactly. And in a lot of these estate planners or journals that are created, there's areas for things like a family tree. There's areas for things like your legacy and what's important to you and what was beneficial. And I have 2 brothers. My parents, thankfully, are both still with us. And my brothers, we all get along on the best of days, but we also don't get along on the best of days because we're 3 boys. That's just the reality of how it works. And when we sat down with our parents and I had this discussion, and my other brothers didn't want to have it, but I forced them. We got to talk about it. We got to talk about what was important, but we also got to share stories and hear stories that as parents, we sometimes don't tell our children because it's something that's from our past. It's from our childhood. It's things that we try to get them not to do. And the conversation that came was something that started off extremely sad, extremely complicated, maybe confusing at times as to why are we doing this? Why are we talking about it? But then it turns into a moment of a celebration, a moment of what are the wishes that are there? What are the things that are important? And why does it matter? So when we have these conversations and we have these dialogues with our families, and we've put a plan in place and we've looked at what's important to us, then we can kind of live comfortably. And the reason I say that, I did my arrangements with my wife last year. I'm going to share a piece of advice here that comes from a young, wise, old soul, is what I've always been told since I was a little kid. But my wife was 29 when she planned her funeral arrangements. I was 33. And I can comfortably say that there isn't a day that passes by now that we can look at each other and we can say, we don't have to worry about if anything happens. We've done things like life insurance. We have all those things that we put together to protect our families. But more importantly, there is no more guessing game. So why is it important to plan? Because your wishes are known. Now, when it comes to individual funeral wishes and what are the things that are needed, it always comes down to each individual is extremely different. And the reason funerals look so different over the last 15 and 20 years is from the perspective that every single individual will want something different. Maybe it's the color of flower that's different. Maybe it's the type of service. Maybe it's the urn. Maybe it's the casket. Maybe it's where we want to be buried at the cemetery. So my biggest recommendation to anybody, as you get to the point in time where you're ready to have the conversation and ready to have the discussion, is to schedule an appointment with your local funeral home sit down and speak to a licensed advisor like myself, like Michelle, like the many other funeral professionals in the area, to sit down and come up with exactly what your options are based on your needs, but more importantly, based on your wishes. Now, with that being said, I'd like to thank everybody again for sitting with us today and hearing what we have to say. I know we'll go to the questions and answers a little bit later, but just thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules and having us join you and share the benefits in the conversation and the knowledge of the importance of looking at putting a plan in place, but also looking at how simple it can be with those 4 simple steps.